everyone. Welcome on behalf of the USC Price School of Public Policy and the USC Center for Inclusive Democracy. I want to thank you very much for joining us. This talk will be conducted over the next hour from 12 to 1 p.m. My name is Mindy Romero. I'm the director and founder of CID, the Center for Inclusive Democracy. And you have joined the first in a brand new series that we are embarking on, webinar series called Every Vote Counts, What's Next After the 2020 Election. This first in a series of webinars is called Lessons Learned. And we are joined by a very distinguished set of speakers today, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Just want to say that, of course, we have been through a monumental and historic election. The purpose really of this election series is to tackle a number of topics that we think are urgent and are pressing, not only for the conversation currently around the election, what happened, which we'll cover today, and lessons learned, but also going forward in terms of examining the state of our democracy and how we can ultimately strengthen it as a society, and certainly how some of our thought leaders can help aid in those conversations and in the actual actions that need to be taken to see us. There we go. One of our panelists has joined us. Great. To see us reach hopefully another election that is not as contentious or as concerning as we've had and that we just went through. So in terms of our panelists here, you'll see on the screen, we have Christian Gross, who'll be actually starting us off today, giving us a wrap-up of turnout in the 2020 general election, and talking specifically within that around the importance of voter access. Christian Gross is the academic director at the USC Schwarzenegger Institute for the State and Global Policy, and he's also an associate professor here at the Price School of Public Policy. Then after we have that wrap up from Dr. Gross, we will move on to our panel conversation. The topic of that conversation is challenges and opportunities in mobilizing voters in the November election, obviously the election that just passed. And just to do a brief introduction, our first panelist for that conversation is Hector Sanchez Barba, who is the executive director of Mi Familia Vota. He's also a senior fellow at the GW Cisneros Hispanic Leadership Institute. Also, Kathy Fung will be joining us she is the national redistricting director, I should say, from Common Cause. And then Dr. Gross will be coming back in to address some of the questions as part of the panel as well. For detailed bios on all of these folks, again, you can scan the QR code that you see there on your screen with simply your camera app. And we'll have a good chunk of time at the end for audience questions. So please get those queued up. You can submit those in the chat function. Or certainly wait to the end when we specifically solicit those questions. Both are fine. So let's go ahead and start. Dr. Gross, if you could kindly go ahead and, I know you have a few slides, share your screen as you need to. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mindy. And it's great to be here with everybody. I'm really excited about this, and I want to give a brief overview of what happened this election. And I want to focus in particular on voter turnout and voter access. And I'm going to also talk just a little bit about a small role that the USC Schwarzenegger Institute played in voter access in this election and in situating it in that broader role. As Mindy said, I'm a professor here at USC Price. I'm also part of the USC Schwarzenegger Institute. So I'm going to talk about it through that lens. And then I'm really interested to hear from Kathy and Hector and Mindy about their thoughts as we go forward. Let me share my screen and then get to this. I want to talk about the importance of voter access in 2020. Voter access can mean a lot of different things, but in this election, especially because of COVID, it really meant a lot of the different ways you can vote. The kinds of things that Dr. Romero studies, vote by mail, absentee voting, in-person voting places, early voting. There were a lot of options in certain places that made it easier to vote this year. And I think that's one of the reasons that we had such high turnout. And many of you may know this, but I think it's really important to situate just the election nationally, right? Of course, Biden has won over Trump by moving several states that had voted for Trump in 2016 towards Biden in 2020. But I want to emphasize the turnout levels and sort of the nonpartisan components of higher turnout. Michael McDonald, who's a professor at the University of Florida, maintains an amazing set of data about turnout over time and across states. He has posted here soon after Election Day that 2020's turnout is likely the highest in over a century, based on the estimates that were coming from early turnout. So we have one of the highest turnouts in the country, and I'm going to talk about why. And like I said, I want to talk about a little bit of the small part that USC Price played in increasing turnout in the 2020 election. This year, the USC Schwarzenegger Institute, which is part of the Price School of Public Policy, announced a program to give grants, the Schwarzenegger Democracy Grants, for voter access in election administration. The purpose of this program was that Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger wanted to open more polling places. We have read about polling closures, voter suppression, the lack of access that many voters, in particular voters of color, have. And he decided that it was important to create an opportunity for people to not use an excuse of not having funds for the reasons that polls are not available, and early voting polling places and in-person polling places. And so this grants program was announced through USC, through the USC Price School, USC Schwarzenegger Institute. Eligible were 989 counties that were formerly covered by the Voting Rights Act. And the program ended up funding millions of dollars in nonpartisan election administration in several states, including Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia, and Alabama. And this is through his generosity. And then also I had the fortune of being the grants administrator for the program. And so I've learned a lot about voter access, which is what I want to tell you about today. So in 2020, I think one big takeaway is that election infrastructure and voting rights are key, right? The longer the lines are at polling places, the less likely you're going to have higher turnout. The fewer options you have, if you can't vote by mail or vote by absentee or vote in person, the less likely you're going to have higher turnout. By increasing nonpartisan election administration and making it easier to drop off your ballots at places, by having more polling places, especially in large populated counties or really large suburban counties that are growing. If we think about places like Texas and Georgia and Arizona, some of the largest communities are suburban areas around the big metros, and they don't really have the infrastructure that is needed to increase turnout. And they need more polling places. And so that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, that voter access was higher in 2020, and turnout was higher as a result. Of course, there's lots of get out the vote mobilization from campaigns, from nonpartisan groups that we're going to hear about later, from other GOTV things. But I think a key takeaway is the importance of election infrastructure run by people at the county level in opening polling places. So I want to focus on two states that were pretty critical in this election, Arizona and Georgia. Both of these states had counties that were funded by the Schwarzenegger Democracy Grants program, and obviously were pretty critical in the election as well. All right, and here's a picture I just wanted to share. And if you're really interested in this, I would encourage you to go to YouTube and watch this entire video. Governor Schwarzenegger called into Maricopa County, which is where Phoenix is located, to speak to poll workers who are pictured here at one of the 14 large drive-through drop-off vote centers that were at football stadiums and sports stadiums and things of that nature. But this is one of the new things that was implemented in Arizona and all around in other parts of the country too, to increase voter access. So the grants program was able to help with these particular drive-through drop-off locations. And as you can see, there's somebody who's got a ballot in their hand and is returning it to a poll worker who's properly masked. This is just one of many ways that it became easier to vote, at least in Maricopa County in 2020. And so what happened in Arizona in general? There was incredible turnout. Nearly 80% of the electorate, just under 80% of the electorate turned out to vote. That is a 5.7 percentage point turnout increase from the presidential election in 2016. And it's also just an insanely high turnout that is amplifies how competitive that state was. And also, I think in the case of Maricopa County, the largest populated county, just how much was emphasized on the importance of voter access in different ways of voting, such as those ballot drop-off locations. All right, the other state I want to talk about through the lens of the Schwarzenegger Democracy Grants Program is Georgia, another key state in terms of mobilization in 2020. Here's a picture of 6 counties from a local news coverage of the grants program that were funded by the Schwarzenegger Institute program. In total, the USC Schwarzenegger Institute funded 10 counties in Georgia to open new election day polling sites. In Clayton County, Georgia, 7 new election day polling sites were opened thanks to a Schwarzenegger grant. In Muskogee County, Georgia, pictured here, 2 new early voting centers were opened, likely increasing turnout there by at least 10 or 20,000 voters, and then other things all across the state. 6 of the counties that were funded were pictured here, and then 4 other counties were funded later. But in general, there was a lot of boost to election infrastructure to hire more poll workers, open early voting centers, open more ballot drop boxes, or open election day polling places. And we can see if that made a difference, and I think it did. So the 10 grants that the Schwarzenegger Institute gave to counties, these are nonpartisan. Every single county that applied received a grant. The counties that received a grant had a 7.1% increase in turnout, percentage point increase in turnout from 2020 relative to 2016. Now, turnout was wide all over the state of Georgia and all over the country. So in other counties that the Schwarzenegger Institute did not fund new polling places for, there was still a big increase in turnout, 6% increase in turnout from 2020 relative to 2016. But what's really interesting is the grants that open these new polling places to create more voter access, to make it easier to vote by having more early voting centers and more polling places and more workers in general, because more workers is a critical part of voter access. It makes lines shorter. That led to 1.1 percentage point more voters on average in counties that were funded by the Schwarzenegger Institute. And that's approximately 75,000 more people who voted thanks to the grants, based on my back of the envelope calculations. We're going to be doing some more fine-grained analysis of this in the future. But the point of this is to brag a little bit about the Schwarzenegger Democracy Grants, but also to figure out what do we need from a public policy standpoint to increase voter access and to increase voting rights. The key thing, it's very straightforward, but it's important, is that you have to increase voting options, as Dr. Romero has talked about in her research regularly. You have to increase nonpartisan access, and the more polling places you have, the more early voting centers you have. In this election in particular, the more opportunities to vote absentee, to vote by mail, the more likely you're going to increase turnout. If it's easier to vote, people will use some of those options and choose which one they want to vote. If the lines are shorter because there's more poll workers and there are more polling places, you're much more likely to see increased turnout. And that's what we see in our little part of USC Price Schwarzenegger Institute in the grants in Georgia, increasing turnout because of voter access being increased. The other big policy takeaways is that, this suggests that there might be an important time to think about National Voting Rights Act Section 5 renewal. This Section 5 has been gutted by the Shelby versus Holder decision. And the voter access and the voter turnout levels we're seeing and differences across counties and states suggest that it may be time to reconsider that. And a lot of people have already have talked about doing that. But in particular, with what we did at the Schwarzenegger Institute, we found a lot of counties weren't interested in applying and have actually closed polling places, and in many states, for instance, Alabama, don't even have early voting. There's of course other huge factors. I think another policy takeaway is we've got to increase funding of our elections. We can't rely on private philanthropy to do this sort of thing. Elections are often the last things funded. Nancy Bourne, an election administrator in Muskogee County, Georgia, told us in a webinar last week that we had at the Schwarzenegger Institute that elections are one of the last things in the budget. There's just a lot of other things, and we have to fund our elections properly to increase voter access, which will increase voter participation. And then, of course, there's lots and lots of other factors that beyond election administration that increased turnout in 2020. And then the speakers, I think, are going to get into some of those. But I think the key policy takeaways, we've got to do more to increase the funds that go to election administration. Nonpartisan election administration at the state and the local level will help increase voter access. All right, and thanks. That's all I've got for this part of it, and I really appreciate everyone having a chance to hear about what we did at the Schwarzenegger Institute, and thanks to Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger's generosity.
Thank you, Dr. Gross, very much for that presentation. So everyone, we're going to go ahead and move into our panel conversation. And again, our topic is challenges and opportunities in mobilizing in the November election. So first question is for Hector. Hi, thank you very much for joining us. From your organization's perspective and the good work that you do, what would you add to the picture that Christian just presented to us?
Oh, thank you for the invitation, Mindy, and thank you everybody for joining us today. These are critical spaces to reflect on elections, and not only on the serious imperfections of our democracy, but also to propose ways to improve it. I'm the CEO of Mi Familia Vota. We are a national civic participation organization. We do voter registration, we do GOTV, we do voter education, citizenship census, really in the communities building a Latino political power. And this year we had the largest field operation in the nation working in the Latino community, not only for the 501c3 perspective, which is the nonpartisan perspective, but also a very aggressive perspective because of where we are ourselves as a nation in history, with the biggest enemy of the Latino community in the White House. So we launched a very strong campaign called Basta Trump to really educate the Latino community on the threat that Trump represents. So the first thing I would like to say about this election is that minorities save our democracy. Every time I talk to anybody or every time I get a call from a reporter, all the media in the nation really ask me why Cubans in Miami voted for Trump. Instead of focusing on the biggest picture that was that almost 6 out of 10 white voters in the nation voted for Trump in this election, while minorities, all the different minorities in the nation voted against Trump in this election. Again, regardless of how we're looking at this from a partisan or non-partisan perspective, is the biggest story that we have in the nation, and it's important to clarify and understand how the minorities literally were in the front lines voting and coming out in historical numbers to make our democracy stronger and to really defend our democracy when we're facing the biggest attacks in the nation. So in that context, we must recognize that minorities have it really difficult, and I'm going to focus on the community that I represent, which is the Latino community. Regardless of all the challenges that we face, Latinos keep coming out in historical numbers. The Latino community has the lowest investment when it comes to anything related to democracy, when it comes to foundations, when it comes to the political parties, when it comes to any institution that promotes democracy, the Latino community receives the lowest investment. And as we all know, there is a direct correlation between investment and turnout. So when historically most of the money related to democracy has gone to white communities, obviously we can expect a higher turnout. But we have seen that when there is a small investment in the Latino community, like we have done in Mi Familia Vota, when we do voter education, when we do voter engagement, when we do citizenship, when we do etc., all the basics of democracy, we see in all those different infrastructures and places that the Latino community outperforms all the different communities. And I want to focus on one state that Christian mentioned, which is Arizona. Arizona is the perfect example of the beauty of democracy and what happens when communities organize. Arizona had, 10 years ago, the most anti-immigrant piece of legislation at the time, SB 1070, literally coming after the Latino and the immigrant community, the Asian community, and other minorities. And Arizona became a space of extremism of politicians like Sheriff Joe Arpaio, some of the most extremist voices in the nation, that opened spaces to what we had now under the Trump administration. You see elements of extremism rising all over the nation. But Arizona was a perfect example of what happens when a community is organized. Mi Familia Vota was one of the organizations that created the table in Arizona, Mi Arizona, with other community organizations that did an amazing work for 10 years, every single day, building political power and investing in the communities, do the groundwork to make sure that the political power was built in those spaces. And what we saw today in Arizona was just an amazing historical element of communities saying enough is enough. The majority of communities over there, 75% of Mexicans in Arizona voted against Trump. We know what happened in the Senate. We know what happened in local elections. So even though I don't want to make this a political conversation, but we went from one state to be extremely red and extremist, an incubation of extremist politicians, to one state that really say enough to hate, enough to all the violence, enough to all the extremism, enough to all the anti-immigrant pieces of legislation. And that's what happened when we invest and build political power from that perspective.
Thank you very much. Okay, Kathy, please certainly tell us a little bit about your organization and the important work that Common Cause does. But my question for you is, what are some of the factors that explain the state of voter representation in the U.S.?
I think it's absolutely correct that you have to start at the top, which is we had an exciting election where the outcome was uncertain and where the urgency was clearly sort of laid out. I would say the second most important factor is absolutely what Hector just laid out, which is that there were a lot of organizations, a lot of community groups that leaned in hard to make sure that voters understood the importance of the election, but also what Common Cause helped to do was to help voters navigate each step of the way. As we started to see governments have to face the reality that COVID was likely going to change everything about the way that we voted or were going to be voting in November, the reality set in that we needed to do a lot to sort of help voters understand what their options were, what was real and what was disinformation, because there were very active disinformation campaigns, and to help them go from a place of intent to carrying out that step. And sometimes that meant having a buddy using texting or email to talk you through and walk you through each step of the way to get you to the ballot box. That was incredibly helpful and important. And I think that investing in that to help voters in the languages that they speak at home, in contexts where they are getting the advice from trusted people is important, because they were also facing a barrage of misinformation and untrusted messengers throughout the entire campaign season. And trying to sort through that was one of the biggest challenges. What I'd say that what Christian laid out in terms of really increasing voter access by making sure once your intent is there, that you can actually carry it out, points to a number of things that some states did. So states like California decided that they were going to invest for the very first time in every single registered voter receiving a ballot in the mail, instead of having to go through a whole request process. And we saw that voter turnout increased because not only was there interest in voting, but if you were concerned about being too close in proximity because of COVID, voting in person, or suddenly there's a reminder in your mail that, hey, here's a ballot, and it's all very easy. It becomes something where we are meeting voters where they are. There are a lot of changes that many jurisdictions engaged in, many for the better, but some of them were heavily battled, right? What I learned about was across the country, state by state, you have a high degree of variability between what some states do and other states do. So in a state like California, not only did we commit to mailing every voter a ballot, but if a voter chose to return that ballot in the mail, we were paying for the postage. And we said you can mail it as long as it's postmarked by election day and it arrives within 17 days of the postmark, we're still counting it. There are many other states where to get a ballot in the mail because you feel unsafe about going in to vote in person, or for whatever other reason it's not possible, you actually have to go into a court. You have to get a notary. You have to get a second witness on the request for an absentee ballot. That's how complicated that was. And then on the back end, how you could return the ballot, we saw many states retract the options that were available. So in some states like Texas, a statewide order by the governor that each county was only allowed to put out one drop box for people to return their ballots, right? To limit the number of vote centers that were available. We saw some states really retract. Now, what I'll say is that it really varied state by state. And so we had a lot of voters who were confused because they might hear something on the news and then suddenly say, wait a second, I'm a week before election day, I haven't mailed my ballot back. What can I do? Is it too late? Because they were hearing on the news that in Wisconsin, right, a court had just been ordered the plaintiffs that if it doesn't arrive by election day, it doesn't count, right? And so there was a lot of voter confusion. And one of the things that we have to think about in terms of voter access is not only making sure that we are fully funding our election administrators to be able to carry out the elections really well and provide more access. It's to create, I think, some basic floor minimums that say that you have to distribute the options for returning your ballot in a way that reflects where your population lives and what their needs are. It cannot be something random and arbitrary like one drop box per county. And to a large extent, what Christian brought up, reviving certain portions of the Voting Rights Act would help to do that. But I think, one of the things that we should be thinking about as we go into 2021 is whether there is legislation that Congress or states can adopt that creates some standards so that people across a state and hopefully even between states can expect that elections would meet a certain minimum amount of service that would be the same regardless of where you go. And the more that we can move to that, the easier it is also then for voters to understand how to return those ballots in a way that is correct and how to meet all the rules. In California, because of COVID, in a strange way, all of a sudden, the governor was issuing executive orders and the legislature was taking action that now made it so that the rules across all counties were the same. And for the first time, for those of us who work in this space, we were able to give a unified message to voters saying, no matter what, here's what the rule is. Incredibly important and helpful because when we confuse voters, we add one more layer to the reasons why people don't vote. And when we increase information and make it simpler, as Christian said, we increase the possibility that once a voter has decided that they want to cast a ballot, they'll actually get all the way to that ballot box and be able to have their ballot cast and counted.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I'm going to go ahead and move us on to the next question. This is actually for all three of our panelists. We'll bring Christian in. Hector, I'll ask you to take it first, and then Kathy, and then Christian. So, and you both have touched on this a little bit already in your remarks, but just focusing specifically on mobilizing voters, what were the challenges that your organization saw and the work that you all did, that you specifically regarding challenges in mobilizing voters and opening up access to voters, in particular voters from historically underrepresented groups?
Yeah, probably that the top of the agenda was COVID. COVID, the Latino community and the immigrant community have been affected the most, the highest number of infections and deaths in the nation. The Latino community is overrepresented in the industries that have been in the front lines responding and keeping our economy going. So the immigrant community overall has been really in the front lines. So COVID for us was a major issue on implementing campaigns. We are a field operation kind of organization. We're in the communities, we're in the mercados, we are in the spaces where our community congregates. So the first thing that I did, obviously, when there was any guidance from the White House coming at the very beginning of COVID, I stopped all the operations in the nation immediately. The safety of our community and the safety of our teams was the very first thing. But it obviously affected the goals that we have. For example, voter registration is we do it one-on-one in person. That's the most effective way to do. Most of the things related to democracy, voter education, GOTB, education on the census, citizenship, etc. This is proven by research. So we immediately had to move to operate everything on digital, and we embrace a lot of the most important tools on digital, but it's not the same. We continue doing phones and texting, etc. So COVID really represents challenges, but at the same time, opportunities to grow as an organization and use different tools to engage our community. One of the biggest challenges that we saw in Cata, I already mentioned this, when it comes to this election was misinformation, because it was coming from the most important office in our nation constantly, to the point that we, as an organization, historically a 501c3 organization, non-partisan organization until this year because of the historical elements that needed our work, we had to have a pronunciation in our community and education, literally saying, do not believe anything that comes from the White House when it comes to democracy, because the misinformation that was coming on when to vote, what to vote, extension of elections, etc., was very not only frustrating, but it was affecting our community. The other element was voter intimidation. The Latino community has suffered the highest level. And yesterday or 2 days ago, the latest numbers from the FBI reports on hate crimes and racial profiling came out. And the Latino community suffered again a drastic increase, especially after El Paso, when 23 to 25 Latinos were killed and targeted. But in general, we saw a drastic increase in the last 4 years in the Trump administration against anybody that looks Latino, immigrant, Mexican, or people that just speak Spanish. This affects our engagement in democracy, because voter intimidation was something very serious. And when Trump was calling on people to go to the polls and intimidate people literally, for families, and we saw this in the field, are very afraid of, I'm going to say openly, Trump supporters coming to our communities. And this affected also how we saw these different elements. And the other one was all the elements of voter suppression, something that is not new, something that we have seen historically, but especially during COVID. We had to fight, actually, we had a lawsuit in Texas with NAACP, literally asking for polling places to make it mandatory to wear a mask. When you have a community like the Latino community that is facing the biggest challenges and the biggest threat with COVID, we were just asking for something so basic. We want people, poll workers, we want anybody that is going into these places to wear a mask. We won that lawsuit. Obviously, it was reversed afterwards, but that was another example. Another example of voter suppression is the serious, how strict it is to do voter registration. We had a big victory in Arizona that extended voter registration for 10 days. That meant 35,000 more voter registrations in that state. But all these examples of anti-democratic elements, we claim to be the most important democracy in the world, but anybody that understands democracy here knows how difficult and how challenging it is for minorities to participate in the democratic process. Yet, we came out in historical numbers really showing the commitment of minorities to be in the front lines, protecting and saving our democracy.
Thank you very much. Kathy?
I think the question was, what sorts of things we have to think about that were unique coming out of this election, and particularly as they might potentially impact on voters of color. And so maybe what I could do is identify a couple of examples of things that we saw. Common Cause was running kind of 2 or 3 programs fairly actively around Election Day. One of them was around voter disinformation and tracking when there was bad information out there and trying to help put out correct information and sort of giving voters the option to have their hand held all the way to the polls, right? The second was to engage in poll monitoring. So going to the polling places, having volunteers disseminate throughout the U.S. to look at, watch, and make sure that the election process was carried out in a way that was fair, and documenting if there were problems, or calling in to try to correct that problem on the spot. And then the third was to work with a very large coalition of organizations to run the election protection hotline and receive thousands and thousands of phone calls directly from voters who were telling us that, they were experiencing a challenge or they were seeing something, and, to try to address those on the spot. I want to go to the poll monitoring because I think that it told us a lot of interesting things that were happening on election day and in the days leading up to it. So during the early voting period, we absolutely saw a lot of what Hector was describing. So voter intimidation, poll worker vigilantism, and then in a strange way, a kind of voter lawlessness, if I can describe it that way. And let me give 3 examples of how that happened. The intimidation in the weekend leading up to Election Day and around on Election Day, there were multiple examples of rallies that were planned, truck rallies with large flags, people honking. It's all right to express your First Amendment speech, but a lot of times they were purposefully planned to be very close to a vote center or a voting location. And they got to be to a place where it was very intimidating if you were a voter to try to make your way through a large crowd that was clearly leaning for one candidate to go in to vote, even if you were in favor of that candidate, because it was like having to walk through an angry mob. And they did this on Election Day and before Election Day, oftentimes sort of having trucks circling round and round, honking and waving flags. We have to think about sort of what the right balance is between allowing for First Amendment speech, but also creating a safe space for voters to be able to go in and cast a ballot if they're going to vote in person. Second, if we're going to give people the option to vote by mail, which I think, people are warming up to and they're getting used to it, and voting early is a good thing, that we have to also think about how we meet people in the space that their needs are addressed. So a lot of times why people go to vote in person is because they need the extra assistance. They want to go in, ask someone to help, or they need the translation, right? And if we're going to mail people ballots in the home, then we need to think about how to appropriately give people the in-language materials that they need, or provide a second line of assistance. So once they receive their ballot, that they can have somebody to help walk them through. What do I do with the ballot now? Do I put it in this envelope? Do I have to sign it? What's the date that I'm supposed to put in? Am I supposed to do something extra, right? Is it supposed to be in a sleeve? 1,000,001 questions that people get very nervous about because they don't have somebody there to give them the official answer. So making sure that if we're going to go to vote by mail, that we're providing that assistance. And then I would say the third is, and I'm sure that there's a much longer list, so these are not by any means like the top 3. But the third is really thinking about how people get their information, and really trying to find ways to put a check mark next to official sources that are providing accurate information, and reaffirming what is real and what's not. This is one of the hardest things, because actually there were a lot of local election administrators that were giving absolutely accurate information, and even now as they're counting ballots, right, they're resisting the very heavy political pressure to do things that are outside of the law. But giving them the support and the space to say, we're actually providing the accurate information about what's going on is very, very important. And I think creating an infrastructure that says, okay, folks, you never thought about your county election administrator before, right? Honestly, like, who thinks about them? Unless you're in the election space. But lifting up that that's actually a really important role. And when they are doing counting, here are the procedures that they do. When they're rolling out, each step of the way, providing people with access to the election process, here's what they do. And we should affirm and celebrate them. We need to go to a culture that celebrates voting, that celebrates participation of poll workers, and that celebrates the people who do the very, very hard job of trying to carry out our elections in a fair and nonpartisan way. And the more that we can lift up those amazing stories, the more that we can also push back on what is an increasing level of distrust around our elections generally, because the impact is not just going to be for 2020. If we don't reestablish that trust moving forward, it could have an erosion of voter participation and an impact that we may be not expecting for future elections, all the way down to local elections. And so it's really important that we start to build that back up.
Yeah, and if I can just add briefly, I agree with you, Kathy and Hector, and from the perspective of the Schwarzenegger Institute, one of the things we also learned is that not just voter intimidation, but election administrator intimidation, right? So there's one of the grant requests we received was for a bulletproof glass in the vote counting area, because there was concern about threats that are coming into these county nonpartisan local election administrators, the people who are doing exactly what you're talking about, Kathy, who are protecting fair and free elections at the local level. And so I think it's actually really important. I just concur with what you said about uplifting those folks, but also in some cases they're putting their own safety at risk to count ballots in a fair and free way. And I think that's important to recognize too, and to provide funding for those elections and to make them fair. And then the other thing that we noticed is that, of course, a lot of local election, not a lot, many local election administrators did not take us up on the option to apply for grants and open new polling places. And some, in fact, have chosen to close polling places or to make it harder to vote. Louisiana, the Secretary of State and Attorney General banned their counties from applying for these grants, right? So I think another challenge to increasing voter turnout is that some of the officials are not as interested in it, and that needs to be sort of audited and examined.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, all of you. So let's move into our last question, and I'll ask all of you just for time to give a quick, maybe 1 minute kind of lightning round answer. But thinking about going forward, what are the lessons learned? If I asked you maybe to give me the top three, to think for a moment to kind of prioritize them in a nutshell, the top 3 lessons learned that we should, or rather maybe I should say that we must apply to future elections. What are they from your perspective? And we'll start with Hector again.
Well, very quickly, times of challenges represent times of opportunities. And even though I focus most of my time on criticism of what we saw this year, but it was an amazing element of different things that we can do to make this a better democracy with more access. So we saw, for example, early voting, historical numbers of in voting and voting by mail. So that could be an example of how making it just easier for everybody to participate in having access to democracy. We saw historical numbers of Latinos voting by mail. So when you can vote by mail, that is so easy instead of waiting for 6 hours. That is what we see in many of our communities. Amazing for democracy. Invest early. We saw what happens again when we invest in minority communities. When we do the basic work for democracy, we come out in historical numbers. And the last one that is important, and it has been in the national media, it has been discussed everywhere, is regulation of social media infrastructures and the role they play in democracy. I'm talking about the Facebooks of the world, the Twitters of the world. We saw some improvement because of the pressure that organizations like Familia and many others that have been involved heavily putting pressure. So I will mention some opportunities to make this a better democracy.
Thank you very much. Kathy,
Yeah.
three lessons learned. That can make
Well,
you-
obviously, Hector's named all of the main ones. So I'll add a few that I think, might be a little pie in the sky, but it's something worth asking. COVID forced us to all rethink what was possible. And I'll say in California, you think that we have everything all lined up, but honestly, like turning around this gigantic ship, right, from April until July, to change the way that we conducted elections in that short a period of time, and then to all be rowing in the same direction, so we're going away from the iceberg and not towards it, was gigantic. I mean, it was huge, but it tells you that there are things that are possible, right? And it points to things that I think can work. One, we have to make elections and voting more accessible. We need to give people the options, and we need to give them consistently in a way that's sort of thoughtful about where places of greatest need are. So I love the idea of mailing everybody a ballot, but let's make sure that we're mailing it to them in a way that is in their language and accessible. I love the idea of giving people voting options, but let's make sure that those places where you're citing the voting locations or voting centers are accessible and where people are comfortable going to. I love the idea of having more drop boxes, but let's make sure we define what an official drop box is and not just any old mailbox that you slapped a piece of paper on that says it's official, okay? Just as, for example, hypothetically. And then I would say we do need to think a lot about how we create a national conversation around, once again, honoring America's way of conducting elections and having a democracy. And it means coming into a national conversation where we try to find some healing. Because we need to come to an agreement that this is something worth saving, it's something worth investing in, and that we are all in it together. It doesn't help for some of us to be tearing it down because it's not just about enfranchisement of populations writ large, but it's about populations that have never been at the table before, potentially being closed out if we don't go the right direction. And it's about the world watching us. Right? We are a standard bearer. And so we have to have some introspection, hopefully, and come to a place where we have a conversation that's hopefully bipartisan, right? That starts to figure out ways that we all need to work on improving our elections, and it doesn't have to be political football anymore.
Thank you, Kathy. Well, Christian, you have to follow.
Yeah, I will concur with one positive and one negative. I concur that we've got to more voter registration, and the ease of access is critical. COVID caused a whole bunch of new options across states that wouldn't have otherwise done it, which helped increase turnout. And that's a plus to continue in the future, even when there isn't COVID. And on the negative, I think we still need to look at what's happening in some communities. There are a lot of, even with historic turnout, there are still counties that really are not trying to make it easier to vote, and they're overlooked, and people aren't paying attention. And for every success story that we can focus on where there is 80% turnout, there's places that refuse to open new polling places, even when you give them funds to do so. We had one instance in a state that we granted money to the local election administrator, but the county commission refused to accept the funds for this election, right? They would take it for the future, but not for this election, and to open polling places. And so there's a lot of places that are not engaged in the access, even as we celebrate the high turnout that we have.
Thank you, all of you, very much. And I love the fact that each of you did focus on both positives and negatives. So I'm going to move us on into audience questions. We have about 9-10 minutes or so. Before I do, I just want to also let the audience know, in case this ends up being relevant to some of the questions you're going to ask. The remaining sessions in our speaker series will cover topics like the peaceful transition of power, or what we hope is a peaceful transition of power, what we need to do in the short run as well as the long term. Also looking at how to avoid polarization, or how to get us out of the polarized state that we're in, and hopefully stay out of that. And then certainly revisiting some of the numbers that Christian gave us around this historic, if not record, historic turnout that we've seen, how exciting that is. And that is a positive of this election, right? How can we get that to be the new normal? Instead of a historic bump, how can we actually look to what would we need to do, right, to start seeing that numbers like that on a consistent basis? So those are some of the topics ahead of us. But I will open it up. I'm going to look here at the questions that are put in the Q&A. And I see one here, just taking them not necessarily in order of importance, of course. I see one here from Kim Alexander, who's a friend of our organization, and she's asking, did the counties that accepted the grants, this is for Christian, receive any criticism in their communities? I know you noted the Board of Elections, but any criticisms in their actual communities, or I would imagine in the press for doing so. Any other challenges there?
It was mostly pretty positive. I mean, so I point to one, some of the Georgia ones in particular had a lot of very positive press, to the point where I think the press started to help increase turnout and make people excited about voting. In that regard, there was a little bit of criticism, of course, and I think this is fair, that private philanthropists are funding our elections when this is perhaps something that the government should be funding more extensively. And so this is sort of a Band-Aid in the year 2020, but it raises a bigger question of funding of elections and the nonpartisan administration of elections via other sources. And so there's some criticism there that is warranted, but I think opens an important policy question.
Thank you. Another question here, and I'll read part of this here for time, but as you all know it, what is the plan or thoughts or conversations that are happening around the country and energy that is present for year-round voter engagement? So what are people talking about? What are people planning in terms of year-round voter engagement? And another part of this question is, what kind of pressure is put on elected officials, right, to hold them accountable, the new administration or otherwise, I assume?
That's a very important question, especially for minorities. How do we build political power year-round and then use that political power to advance policy priorities? I've been in DC for 20 years and advocating on literally every single issue. Every single issue that we advocate for, we're at the very bottom and just asking for a little bit of access. I think really using the political power and building that political power to define local and national elections can give us a better chance and opportunity to also build campaigns of accountability. For example, Mi Familia Vota, this year, early on, we launched Prioridades 2020. It was an accountability campaign to invite all the presidential candidates to meet with us on the record and on camera to give us to commit to specific priorities, for example, on immigration and how it was going to happen, deportations and how and when, Puerto Rico, etc. Things that we really needed an immediate answer. For example, with Vice President Biden, President-elect Biden, we have him on record. And right now we're about to launch a campaign, Prioridades 2020, just really focusing on the promises that he made. He said he was going to stop deportations. He said he was going to have an immigration bill in the first 100 days. He promised an agenda for Puerto Rico. He held, obviously for us, COVID is a top priority, etc. So, but it's about building that political power and use that muscle, not only to get politicians elected, but to make our advocacy more aggressive instead of just kind of be knocking on doors and nobody. Immigration is a perfect example. How can a nation not have basic elements of immigration when we depend on 11 million undocumented workers? Is hypocrisy at its best.
Perhaps the only thing that I would add to that, and I'm going to cite to Yellow Pain's music video, which I'm going to admit, I didn't stumble it on myself. Some folks younger than me had introduced me to it, but he walks through why our communities need to think about voting in all, or how voter participation impacts on all three branches of our government, and why thinking about that is important, because you can't affect change if you're just focused on the presidency. So what I'll add as a layer to what Hector said is we also have to think about what's going on with Congress, and we also have to think about what's going on in our courts. And I know that one of the hardest things when you get to the ballot is that little section that has the judges' names, and you're wondering, like, how am I supposed to tell the difference between this and that? But I do think that, like, spending a little bit of time to sort of understand the differences, looking at voter guides or talking to friends and family is really important. And then I think that holding people accountable at every level of government, federal, state, and local, also important, because a lot of those decisions happen and they filter up, and participation is measured by people getting involved at many different levels. And sometimes that can create a very strong echo chamber where you can affect change at the local level, and it is heard by representatives at a state level or even at a federal level. So lots of ways for people to participate and not to feel like, you're just shouting into a void when you're trying to move somebody at the very top. Lots of ways to make that power felt.
Thank you both. Kathy, I'm going to turn this next question over to you, and hopefully I'll give you a challenge here if you could answer it just really briefly.
Okay.
It's any comment. Question is any comments. This is from Facebook, one of our Facebook viewers. Any comments about ballot harvesting laws here in California? Should non-official third-party handling of ballots be allowed, like the non-official drop boxes?
Lord, on election day, there were two things that were really kind of, or leading up to election day in California, that were vexing for us. One was this high number of unofficial drop boxes that were touted by political campaigns. And sometimes they actually had the words official drop box on them. For people to return their ballots to. And what the campaign said was, okay, and then we'll just turn them over to officials. And then the second was actually campaigns running voting centers, right? And ostensibly, inviting people to come and, they would print out a ballot and help people mark up that ballot. What I'll say is that there has to be a really robust conversation that distinguishes between a community group that might be nonpartisan doing that kind of service and a campaign doing it or a party doing it. Something that's an entity that's already leaning in for a particular candidate. I also think we have to distinguish between what's official and what is unofficial. And if voters are confused and they think that they're bringing something to an actual vote center or putting something into an actual drop box that a county official will pick up, only to find out that it's being sorted by someone on the back end, I think that's really problematic. And frankly, I think that if a campaign's going to do it, they need to do it in coordination with the county officials so that if voters have questions, at least there's some semblance of accountability. I think this election, we just had people kind of running rampant and there was a lot of misinformation, and it's unclear whether there was also misbehavior.
Thank you. I know I gave you a challenge there for that question. So I'm going to close this out. There's one question that I can answer really quickly regarding research around rejection rates. And yes, my research center is currently conducting research on both the primary and general election in California and examining rejection rates, and that'll be coming out in pieces over the next few months. To my panelists, thank you very much for joining us, Hector, Kathy, and Christian, and to everyone that is on Facebook and on Zoom. Thank you very much for participating with us and adding to the conversation. We hope to see you in our next session. Again, Peaceful Transition of Power, and that is on December 3rd. Thank you all. Have a great day.